In a small town that has forgotten one of its own, a 90-year-old black war veteran watches yet another parade pass him by without recognition. But when a motorcycle club hears of his quiet pain, they vow to change everything, drawing unexpected attention to a man whose bravery had long been ignored. Will the town finally acknowledge his sacrifice? Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. James Thompson sat at the small, worn kitchen table in his modest home, his fingers tracing the familiar grooves in the wood. The house, like him, had seen better days. Built decades ago, it had weathered countless storms, much like the man who now quietly inhabited its rooms. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains, casting a soft glow on the military medals that hung on the wall, remnants of a life that felt both distant and ever-present. He was 90 years old now, a World War II veteran, though you wouldn't know it just by looking at him. His tall, once broad-shouldered frame had thinned with age, and his hands, once steady and strong, now trembled ever so slightly. The wrinkles on his face told the story of time passing, but the real story lay in his heart, the memories of battles fought, friends lost, and sacrifices made for a country that seemed to have forgotten him. It was almost time for the annual town parade. Every year, the small town of Millbrook held a celebration, honoring its veterans and local heroes. It was a day of fanfare, with flags waving and children laughing. Floats would glide down the main street, carrying decorated veterans from wars both recent and long past. And every year, James watched from the sidelines, standing among the crowd, unseen. As he looked out the window, James saw the townspeople bustling about, preparing for the event. Banners were being strung between lampposts, and the smell of barbecue and fried food was already wafting through the air. Families strolled down the sidewalks, holding hands with their children, all dressed in patriotic red, white, and blue. It was a day of celebration, but for James, it was a reminder of how easily people forget. The memories of the war were never far from his mind. He had been just a young man when he enlisted, barely out of his teens. He had gone overseas with hopes and fears, like so many others, not knowing what lay ahead. He had fought in battles that most people now only read about in history books, seen horrors that he rarely spoke of. Yet despite the toll it took on him, he had served his country with pride, believing in the values he was fighting for. But when the war ended, and he returned home, something shifted. The world had moved on, and so had the people in it. Veterans like him were expected to quietly reintegrate into society, to leave the war behind and build new lives. James did his best to do just that. He found work, married his high school sweetheart, raised a family, and tried to push the memories of war to the back of his mind. Still, there were reminders. Every night, the images of those he had fought beside, and those who never made it back, came rushing in as soon as he closed his eyes. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind drifting back to those distant battlefields. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night, his heart pounding, with the phantom sound of gunfire ringing in his ears. But he never complained. He never sought sympathy or attention. He was just grateful to be alive, to have a family, and to have made it home. Now, however, his family was scattered. His wife had passed away years ago, and his children lived in different states, busy with their own lives. His granddaughter, Maya, visited when she could, and her visits were the highlight of his weeks. She was the only one who seemed to truly understand what he had been through, or at least she tried to. But even she didn't know the full story. He had never told her about the worst parts of the war. It wasn't something you could explain to someone who hadn't been there. James sighed and stood up from the table. He walked over to the closet and slowly pulled out his old uniform. It was neatly pressed, just as it had been the day he came home from the war. His fingers brushed over the faded fabric, and for a moment he hesitated. Did it even matter anymore? He had worn it to the parade every year, but no one had ever noticed. No one had ever thanked him for his service or asked him about his experiences. To them, he was just another face in the crowd, an old man who had lived too long. But today, something pushed him to put it on again. Maybe it was the thought that this might be his last parade, or maybe it was the hope, however faint, that someone might see him this time. He buttoned the jacket, carefully adjusting the medals pinned to his chest. Each one told a story of bravery, of survival, of comrades lost. But to the townspeople, they were just decorations, meaningless symbols on an old man's uniform. As James left his house and walked towards the parade route, he felt the familiar weight of those medals pressing against his chest. The streets were already lined with people, laughing and chatting, completely unaware of the man walking among them. James found his usual spot on the corner of Main Street, where he had stood every year. He positioned himself at the front of the crowd, hopeful that someone might notice him this time. The parade began with the blaring sound of trumpets and the rhythmic beat of drums. Floats adorned with flags rolled down the street, carrying veterans from more recent wars, men younger than James, their faces full of pride. The crowd erupted in applause, cheering for the soldiers who had served. But as the floats passed by, no one turned their head towards James. He stood there, his heart sinking as he watched the parade move forward, leaving him behind once again. The day that was meant to honor veterans had, for James, become a reminder of how forgotten he had become. As the final float passed by and the parade ended, the streets quickly emptied. Families rushed off to enjoy the rest of the festivities, leaving James standing alone on the sidewalk. His medals, gleaming in the afternoon sun, went unnoticed. The town had moved on, just as it had all those years ago when he returned from the war. James turned and began the long walk back home, his heart heavy with the familiar weight of being invisible. As James Thompson walked home, each step felt heavier than the last. His heart, already worn by age and memory, seemed to sink deeper into his chest. He had been prepared for the disappointment. After all, it had happened for years. But this time, something about the silence around him cut deeper than ever before. The parade had moved on, and so had the town. He had watched as people laughed, cheered, and waved flags, completely oblivious to the old man standing alone in his uniform. A part of him had always hoped that one day, maybe this year, someone might stop and recognize him, might ask him about the medals on his chest, or about the stories behind them. But year after year, he had remained a ghost, unnoticed and unacknowledged. As he turned the corner onto his quiet street, James couldn't shake the feeling of rejection. He had served his country with pride. He had fought for the very freedoms these people were celebrating. Yet, here he was, forgotten, as if his sacrifices had never happened. The uniform he wore, the medals he had earned, they all seemed invisible to the world around him. When he finally reached his front door, James hesitated. The small house had always been a sanctuary, a place where he could retreat from the world. But today, even that felt hollow. The loneliness pressed in on him, and for a moment he stood there, unsure if he wanted to go inside and face the quiet solitude that awaited him. With a sigh, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The house was just as he had left it, neat, orderly, but empty. The walls, covered in framed photographs of his family and his time in the service, seemed to mock him now. Each picture told a story of a life that had once been full, of a time when he had been needed, respected, and loved. But now, most of those people were gone. His wife Margaret had passed away more than a decade ago, and his children had moved away, busy with their own lives. It was just him now and the memories. James walked slowly to the living room and sat down in his favorite armchair, the one Margaret had insisted they buy when they first moved into the house. He closed his eyes, letting the silence of the room settle over him. The uniform felt stifling now, a reminder of the past that seemed too distant to matter anymore. A knock on the door broke the stillness. James opened his eyes and listened, unsure if he had imagined it. But then it came again, a light but firm tapping. He stood, making his way back to the front door, and opened it to find his granddaughter Maya standing on the porch, a wide smile on her face. "Grandpa!" she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him before he could react. Her youthful energy filled the space between them, and for a moment the heaviness in his chest lifted. "I came as soon as I could after the parade. How was it? Did they finally recognize you?" James managed a weak smile and shook his head. "Same as always, Maya. Just me watching from the sidelines." Her face fell instantly, the excitement draining away. "What do you mean? You're wearing your uniform. You've got all these medals. How could they not?" She stopped, frustration evident in her voice. This isn't right, Grandpa. You should have been up there front and center. James shrugged, trying to brush it off, but the truth was, it hurt. He had told himself for years that it didn't matter, that he didn't need the recognition. But deep down, the rejection stung more than he wanted to admit. I'm too old for all that now, he said quietly, looking down at the floor. People forget, and that's all right. I've lived my life. The war was a long time ago. Maya stepped back, her eyes full of empathy and anger at the same time. No, Grandpa, that's not all right. You deserve to be recognized. You served your country. How could they ignore that? Her voice was fierce now, fueled by the injustice of it all. I'm going to tell people. I'm going to make sure they know what you've done. James shook his head, raising a hand to stop her. You don't need to do that, Maya. It's not important. It is important, she insisted. You sacrificed so much, and they just let you stand there as if you don't matter. That's not okay. People need to know what you did. They need to know who you are. James smiled softly at her passion. She reminded him so much of Margaret, the same fiery determination, the same belief in doing what was right, no matter what. But he knew better than anyone that sometimes the world didn't work that way. Sometimes people just forgot. I appreciate it, Maya, he said, his voice gentle but firm. But you don't need to fight this battle for me. I've made my peace with it. Maya looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign that he truly believed that. But all she saw was the sadness he was trying to hide. She bit her lip, holding back the words she wanted to say. Instead, she reached out and took his hand. I love you, Grandpa, she whispered, and I'm proud of you no matter what. James squeezed her hand, grateful for the small comfort she offered. I know, sweetheart, I love you too. They stood there for a moment, the silence between them filled with unspoken words. Maya wanted to do more, to make the world see the man she knew, a hero who had given so much without asking for anything in return. But James, ever the humble soldier, had learned long ago that sometimes the fight wasn't worth it. That night, after Maya had gone home, James sat alone in the quiet of his house. The weight of the day still hung over him, heavy and suffocating. He looked over at the old photographs on the walls, the black and white images of his fellow soldiers, the faces of friends he had lost. He thought of the ones who never came back, who had given everything for their country. They had never been honored either, not in the way they deserved. As he sat there, the ache in his heart grew stronger. The uniform now draped over the back of the chair seemed to mock him, reminding him of a time when he had mattered, when he had been part of something larger than himself. But now, as an old man, alone and forgotten, he wondered if any of it had ever truly mattered at all. James closed his eyes and let the darkness settle over him, trying to push the thoughts away. But no matter how hard he tried, the feeling of being invisible lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. The sun had barely risen when Marcus Chief Harris scrolled through his phone over a cup of coffee. His mornings were usually quiet, a chance to gather his thoughts before the day's responsibilities set in. As the president of the Steel Warriors, a local black motorcycle club known for their dedication to veterans and community service, Marcus had seen a lot of stories about forgotten heroes. But none of them hit quite as hard as the post he stumbled upon that morning. It was a simple photo. An old man, dressed in a worn military uniform, standing alone on the sidewalk during the town parade. His granddaughter Maya had written a heartfelt post about her grandfather, James Thompson, a 90-year-old World War II veteran who had been ignored by the parade for years. Her words were filled with frustration and sadness, recounting how every year James stood hopeful that someone would notice him, only to be overlooked again and again. Marcus sat back in his chair, the weight of the story sinking in. He couldn't believe what he was reading. How could someone like James be so easily forgotten? A war hero, a man who had risked everything, and yet his own town treated him like a ghost. It didn't sit right with him. Not one bit. Marcus knew what it was like to be overlooked. As a black man, he had seen firsthand how society sometimes pushed people to the margins, especially those who didn't fit the image of the typical American hero. But in his world, veterans were sacred. The Steel Warriors were made up of men who had served in the military, and they held a deep respect for anyone who had worn the uniform. Marcus himself had done 2 tours in the Gulf War, and he knew the toll that service took on a person's soul. He read Maya's post again, feeling the familiar anger rise up inside him. This wasn't right. James Thompson deserved better, far better. He deserved the respect and recognition he had earned with his blood, sweat, and tears. The fact that the town had ignored him for so long was something Marcus couldn't let go of. It was time for the Steel Warriors to step in. Setting his phone down, Marcus finished his coffee and headed out to the garage, where the rest of the club was meeting that morning. As he entered the spacious room, the familiar sound of banter and the clinking of tools greeted him. The Steel Warriors were more than just a motorcycle club. They were a brotherhood. Each member was a veteran, and their bond ran deeper than the chrome and leather that adorned their bikes. "Morning, Chief," one of the members, Big Dave, called out from across the garage, wiping grease off his hands. "You're looking serious today." Marcus nodded, his expression stern. "I've got something I want to talk to you all about." The room quieted as the club members gathered around. Marcus wasn't one to speak lightly, and when he had something on his mind, the others listened. As they stood in a circle, Marcus shared the story of James Thompson. He told them about the town parade, about how James had been ignored for years despite his service, and about how his granddaughter was fighting to make sure her grandfather's legacy wasn't forgotten. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then, one by one, the members began to speak. "That's messed up," Big Dave muttered, shaking his head. "How does that happen? A man gives everything for his country, and they just forget." "You know how it is," said Rico, another member who had served in Vietnam. "They don't always remember us, especially if we don't look like what they think a hero should look like." "That's exactly it," Marcus said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "But we're not going to let that stand. James deserves better, and we're going to make sure he gets it." The room buzzed with agreement. The Steel Warriors were a proud group, and they didn't take lightly to injustice, especially when it came to one of their own. They knew what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, and to come home to a world that didn't always understand the weight of that sacrifice. They had seen too many veterans fall through the cracks, homeless, forgotten, struggling. But James wasn't going to be one of them. Not on their watch. Marcus laid out his plan. The Steel Warriors were going to organize their own tribute to James Thompson. They would gather as many bikers as they could from across the state, and they would ride through Millbrook in honor of James. It wasn't going to be some quiet, small-town affair either. This was going to be loud, proud, and impossible to ignore. If the town didn't want to recognize James, then the Steel Warriors would make sure they had no choice but to see him. "We're going to show them what respect looks like," Marcus said, his voice rising with the passion he felt. "We'll ride into that town, and they'll know James Thompson's name by the time we're done. We're going to give him the recognition he deserves." The club erupted in agreement. They were all in. Over the next few days, Marcus and the other club members reached out to fellow motorcycle clubs, veterans organizations, and anyone else they thought would want to be part of the tribute. The response was overwhelming. Word spread quickly, and soon, bikers from neighboring towns and even other states were pledging to ride in honor of James. The excitement grew as the date for the ride approached. What had started as a small idea had quickly snowballed into something much bigger. The media caught wind of the event, and local news outlets began covering the story of James Thompson, the forgotten hero, and the motorcycle club that was determined to make sure he was forgotten no longer. As the big day approached, Marcus reached out to Maya to let her know what the Steel Warriors were planning. She was overwhelmed with emotion when she heard the news. "I can't believe you're doing this for my grandfather," she said, her voice shaking with gratitude. "He doesn't even know. He's going to be so surprised." "We're not doing this for recognition," Marcus replied, his tone steady. "We're doing it because it's the right thing to do. Your grandfather deserves to be honored. We're just making sure that happens." Maya thanked him again, her heart full. She knew her grandfather would never expect something like this, but she also knew it would mean the world to him. As Marcus hung up the phone, he took a deep breath. This was going to be something special, something that would show not just James but the whole town, that some people would never be forgotten. The Steel Warriors were about to make history, and for once, James Thompson would be at the center of it. For Marcus, and for the rest of the club, this wasn't just about one man. It was about honoring every veteran who had been overlooked, every hero who had come home to a world that moved on without them. James Thompson was a symbol of something much bigger, and they were going to make sure his story was told. The day of the ride was fast approaching, and as Marcus looked around the garage at the men who had become his family, he knew that they were ready. This was going to be a day to remember, not just for James, but for everyone who believed that no sacrifice should ever be forgotten. As the day of the tribute approached, the energy around the event was palpable. What had begun as a small idea had quickly grown into something much larger than anyone expected. News of the motorcycle club's plan to honor James Thompson had spread far beyond the town of Millbrook. Calls and messages were pouring in from other motorcycle clubs, veterans groups, and even media outlets wanting to cover the event. It seemed that James's story had struck a chord with people across the country, many of whom had their own stories of loved ones who had served and been forgotten. Marcus Chief Harris and the Steel Warriors were working non-stop to make sure everything came together. The garage had become the epicenter of planning, with members coming and going, coordinating with other clubs and community organizations. Each day, more bikers confirmed their participation, eager to be part of something meaningful. The number of riders had swelled far beyond what Marcus had originally envisioned. What had started as a small gathering of local bikers had turned into a full-scale event. One afternoon, as Marcus and the club were finalizing plans, Maya Thompson arrived at the garage. She had been following the preparations closely, but today she had something special in mind. "Hey, Chief," she greeted Marcus as she entered. "I was wondering if I could ask you a favor." Marcus smiled warmly at her. He had grown fond of Maya over the past few weeks. Her dedication to her grandfather's legacy reminded him of why this tribute was so important. "Of course, Maya. What's on your mind?" Maya hesitated for a moment, her hands fiddling with a small box she was holding. "I've been thinking about how much this is going to mean to my grandpa. He doesn't even know what's coming. And I want to make sure it's perfect." Marcus nodded. "We're doing everything we can to make it special. Your grandfather is going to be honored in a way he deserves." "I know," Maya said, her voice soft, "but I want to give him something extra, something personal." She opened the box she was holding, revealing a brand new leather jacket. It was sleek, black, and beautifully crafted, but what stood out most was the custom embroidery on the back. In elegant golden thread, it read, "James Thompson, WOI2 veteran, honored hero." Below the words was an intricate image of the American flag with a pair of military dog tags draped over it. "I had this made for him," Maya explained, her voice full of emotion. "I know he's proud of his medals and his uniform, but I wanted him to have something he could wear with the bikers, something that shows the world who he is." Marcus looked at the jacket, clearly moved by the gesture. "That's beautiful, Maya. He's going to love it." "I hope so," Maya replied, blinking back tears. "He's given so much, and I just want him to feel proud again. I want him to know that people still care." Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder. "He'll know, Maya. We're going to make sure of it." With the jacket safely stored away, the preparations continued. The Steel Warriors worked tirelessly, and soon the day of the ride was upon them. That morning, the sky was a clear, crisp blue, a perfect day for what was about to unfold. The streets of Millbrook were already buzzing with anticipation. The town, initially caught off guard by the sudden media attention, had finally realized that something big was about to happen. Many of the residents who had been unaware of James Thompson's story had now heard of the upcoming tribute and had come out to see it for themselves. By mid-morning, the sound of motorcycles could be heard in the distance, a low rumble that grew louder and louder with each passing minute. The bikers had gathered at a staging area just outside of town, and the sight of hundreds of motorcycles revving their engines, flags waving proudly, was enough to give anyone chills. James Thompson, however, knew nothing of what was about to happen. Maya had convinced him to attend a small veterans ceremony that morning. promising him that it would be different from the parade. She hadn't told him about the tribute, wanting it to be a complete surprise. As they arrived at the ceremony location, a large park in the center of town, James noticed something unusual. There were far more people than he expected, and the sound of motorcycles echoed in the distance, growing louder by the second. "What's going on, Maya?" James asked, glancing around. "This doesn't seem like a small ceremony." Maya smiled, her heart pounding with anticipation. "Just wait, Grandpa. You'll see." Before James could ask more, the first wave of motorcycles came into view. Hundreds of bikers, dressed in leather and denim, roared down the main street of Millbrook, their engines thundering like a force of nature. At the front of the pack rode Marcus Harris, the Steel Warrior's banner flying behind him. The sight was breathtaking. Behind Marcus, rows upon rows of bikers followed, their bikes adorned with American flags and signs that read, "Honor our veterans," and "James Thompson, our hero." The streets were lined with people, residents, veterans, and visitors from neighboring towns, all watching in awe as the procession rolled through the heart of Millbrook. James stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Maya, what is this?" Maya's smile widened, tears welling in her eyes. "This is for you, Grandpa. It's all for you." As the motorcycles pulled up to the park, the bikers dismounted and began to gather around James. Marcus was the first to approach him, extending his hand in greeting. "Mr. Thompson," Marcus said, his voice steady with respect, "we're here today to honor you for everything you've done and for everything you've sacrificed." James looked around, stunned by the sheer number of people who had come to honor him. He couldn't find the words. His heart raced as he looked at the bikers, the flags, and the crowd that had gathered just for him. He had spent years feeling invisible, forgotten by the very community he had served. But today, standing in the middle of the crowd, he was anything but invisible. Marcus continued, "We know you've been overlooked for too long, but not today. Today, you're our hero, and we're here to make sure everyone knows it." The crowd erupted in applause as Marcus handed James the custom leather jacket that Maya had made for him. James held it in his hands, his eyes brimming with emotion as he read the inscription on the back. "Put it on, Grandpa," Maya whispered. "You're one of them now." With trembling hands, James slipped the jacket on, the weight of it feeling both familiar and foreign. He looked down at the patch that bore his name and his service, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the pride that had been buried for so many years. The bikers gathered around James, shaking his hand, patting him on the back, and offering their heartfelt thanks for his service. He was no longer a forgotten figure on the sidelines. He was the center of attention, a man whose legacy was being honored in the most powerful way imaginable. As the ceremony continued, local veterans and community leaders gave speeches in James's honor, recounting his service in World War II, his bravery, and his sacrifice. But it wasn't just the words that mattered. It was the sense of belonging, the knowledge that he hadn't been forgotten after all. As the tribute ended and the bikers prepared to leave, James stood in the center of the crowd, surrounded by people who finally saw him for the hero he was. He looked at Maya, his heart full of gratitude and emotion he hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the noise of the crowd. "Thank you for seeing me." Maya hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You deserve it, Grandpa. You've always deserved it." For James Thompson, the years of being invisible had ended. Today, he was seen, honored, and cherished. And as the motorcycles roared back to life, preparing for one final ride through the town, James knew that this was a moment he would carry with him for the rest of his days. As the roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance and the crowd began to disperse, James Thompson remained rooted to the spot, still in awe of what had just transpired. His heart was heavy with emotion, but for the first time in many years, it wasn't the weight of being forgotten. It was the overwhelming realization that he was finally seen, recognized, and honored. He glanced down at the leather jacket he wore, the golden embroidery shimmering in the late afternoon sun. His name, James Thompson, World War II veteran, was there for everyone to see, the American flag and the dog tags a reminder of his service. He hadn't felt this proud in decades. It was a pride that had been buried deep inside him, suffocated by years of neglect and silence. Now it rose within him like a long dormant flame, filling him with a warmth he hadn't known in years. The townspeople, many of whom had been unaware of James's service, approached him one by one. They shook his hand, offered words of thanks, and shared their own stories of relatives who had served. Some were teary-eyed, apologetic even, for not knowing about his sacrifices sooner. Others were simply awestruck by the scale of the tribute, their voices trembling as they expressed their gratitude. James smiled and nodded, his voice soft but steady. "Thank you," he repeated over and over. "Thank you for being here. It means the world to me." Maya stood by his side, watching the interactions with pride. Her heart swelled as she saw her grandfather finally receive the recognition he so deeply deserved. She knew how hard it had been for him all these years, quietly bearing the weight of his service without ever demanding anything in return. Today, though, the world had come to him, and it had come in a way neither of them had ever imagined. As the last of the crowd drifted away, the town square grew quiet. The sunlight was beginning to fade, casting long shadows over the park. James and Maya stood together, soaking in the silence, when a familiar voice interrupted their thoughts. "Mr. Thompson." James turned to see Marcus Harris, the leader of the Steel Warriors, approaching with a few of his fellow bikers. His broad frame cast a shadow over the ground as he reached out to shake James's hand once again. "I just wanted to say," Marcus began, his voice gruff but sincere, "that this was long overdue. You should have been honored a long time ago." James looked into Marcus's eyes, seeing the same respect and gratitude that had been expressed throughout the day. He nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I never expected this," he said quietly. "Not in my wildest dreams." Marcus smiled, but it was a sad smile. "A lot of us know what it's like to feel invisible," he said. "But not today. Today, you're a hero." James swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "I don't feel like a hero. I was just doing my duty, like so many others." Marcus placed a hand on James's shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. "Maybe," he said, "but it's heroes like you who remind us why we have the freedom to ride, to live the lives we do. Your sacrifices, your service, they matter. Don't ever doubt that." The words hit James harder than he expected. For so long he had questioned whether what he had done had truly mattered. He had wondered if anyone even cared anymore. But here, standing among these men, these bikers who had traveled from all over to honor him, he knew the answer. It mattered. It always had. As Marcus and the other bikers prepared to leave, they gathered in a circle around James, forming a protective wall of solidarity. They offered him a final salute, a gesture that sent chills down his spine. These men, these brothers in arms, had taken him into their fold, treated him like one of their own. It was a bond forged not just in shared experiences, but in mutual respect and understanding. James raised his hand in return, his voice steady as he said, "Thank you, gentlemen. I'll never forget this." With a final nod, the bikers mounted their motorcycles, the engines rumbling to life once more. As they rode off into the evening, the sound of their departure echoed through the quiet streets of Millbrook, leaving behind a town forever changed. The days that followed were a blur of emotion and reflection for James. The story of his tribute had spread far beyond the small town, with local news stations and national outlets picking up on the event. Letters and messages began to pour in, some from fellow veterans who had also felt overlooked, others from families who had lost loved ones in the war. Each message carried with it a deep sense of gratitude, not just for James's service, but for the recognition that his tribute had inspired. James spent his afternoons sitting on his porch, reading each letter with care. Some brought tears to his eyes, while others made him smile with memories of his time in the service. He had always been a man of few words, but now, for the first time, he found himself wanting to share his story. He wanted to tell people about the men he had served with, about the battles they had fought, and about the camaraderie that had kept them going in the darkest of times. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Maya joined him on the porch. She carried a small notebook with her, a pen tucked behind her ear. "What's that?" James asked, eyeing the notebook with curiosity. Maya smiled and sat down beside him. "I was thinking," she said, "that maybe it's time we wrote some of this down. Your story deserves to be told, Grandpa. Not just for you, but for all the men who served with you. People need to remember." James hesitated, his eyes drifting out to the fading light. He had spent so many years keeping his story to himself, unsure if anyone wanted to hear it. But now, after everything that had happened, he realized that Maya was right. His story, and the stories of the men who had served alongside him, deserved to be remembered. He nodded slowly, his voice soft but resolute. "All right, Maya, let's do it." For the next several hours they sat together, the notebook resting on Maya's lap as James began to speak. He told her about the war, the long days and sleepless nights, the fear that gnawed at them constantly, and the small moments of joy that had kept them sane. He spoke of the friends he had lost, their faces still clear in his mind after all these years, and the ones who had made it home, only to be forgotten by the country they had served. Maya wrote down every word, her pen moving swiftly across the pages as James' story unfolded. She listened intently, knowing that this was more than just a history lesson. This was a gift, a chance to preserve a legacy that might have otherwise been lost to time. As the night grew darker, James paused, his voice catching in his throat. "You know," he said quietly, "I always wondered if any of it mattered, if anyone would care. But now, after all this, I know they do. I know it mattered." Maya reached over and took his hand, her grip gentle but firm. "It always mattered, Grandpa. And now the whole world knows." James smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. He squeezed Maya's hand, feeling a peace settle over him that he hadn't known in years. The tribute, the outpouring of love and respect, it had given him something he hadn't realized he had lost. It had given him his pride back, and with it, the knowledge that his story, his life, had made a difference. As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, the stars twinkling overhead, James Thompson finally felt whole. He was no longer invisible. He was seen, he was honored, and most importantly, he was remembered. For James, the journey wasn't just about the tribute. It was about reclaiming his place in the world. And as he gazed out at the darkened horizon, the weight of the past lifted from his shoulders, leaving him with a heart full of gratitude, pride, and peace. His story would live on, not just in the pages of a notebook, but in the hearts of all who had come to honor him. And that, James thought with a smile, was more than he could have ever asked for. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.